So in today's episode, we chat with GoPro on their commitment and programs related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We explore the impacts of their initiatives, as well as how did they get their entire organization on board, challenges, and more. Let's make a social impact. Hi everyone, I'm Carl. Welcome to the Social Impact Show, where CSR professionals get the latest strategies and tips to help them scale and grow their CSR and goodness programs. Now remember, if this is your first time on this channel and you want to get the latest strategies from the experts, hit the subscription button below, hit the little notification bell so you don't miss anything. So today we're joined by two special guests. My first guest is a guest co-host, who is Erica Graham Jordan, who is the Regional Vice President at Benevity. And we're also joined by Anastasia Greenmore with GoPro, who is a Senior Inclusion, Diversity, and Cause Business Partner. Thank you very much both for joining us.
Good to be here. Let's jump in. Anastasia, we are thrilled to have you today. We're going to ask you a few questions, but both around your programs and also so our listeners can get a better sense of how what you have done might inspire, excite, or serve as a framework for how they can tackle some of these areas. So jumping in. So what do your purpose efforts at GoPro entail? What do they look like?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you both. And good morning, good day, good evening to everyone listening. I'm really grateful that you all asked me to be on the show. I'm really excited to kind of share this with you all. So at GoPro, I think our purpose efforts derive directly from our mission and our values. Our underlying mission is to be a force for positivity in the world and celebrating and inspiring people to live active lifestyles. And with our product, I think we have a really interesting opportunity to help people get the most out of their experiences and inspiring others with their creativity. So it's like this awesome cycle of inspiration. And our company values run really deeply through all of our purpose efforts as well. And the two that I kind of constantly am thinking about in our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programming are make friends. So how do we collaborate? How do we build authentic partnerships, and integrity always? And how do we do that in a way that brings only integrity to the mix? And so those guiding principles, I think, are really key to our purpose efforts here at GoPro.
In our prep conversation, it was so intrinsic that you can tell the company values it came from the inside out, right? When you think about the purpose work. Yeah. But then even when you think about how does purpose fit into your business strategy then, aligning with these company values and purpose work? How do they all kind of coexist and or amplify each other?
So for us, last year was really important in how we'd always had this diversity, these values around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really strong around belonging. And last year, the challenge was to figure out how does that fit into the overall business strategy? How do we make this holistically run through and through the company? And I think, we've begun to take the steps and make the progress to do that. And one of the key things was just the sheer level of support and buy-in we had from our leadership to invest in and to create a strategic program that really did sit throughout the business and wasn't sort of just on the people team or in the HR function or, with like a subset of employees. And so the awareness, I think, in how it can sit in different organizations within the business has been really important for us. So whether that's, in our big marketing org and how diversity and representation live there, or it's something like vendors or that we're working with, or accessibility efforts on campus. How do we strengthen all those business functions by looking at things with an equity lens?
That's really hard work. And so kudos to you. I mean, that's so thorough, it's so detailed, it's cross-functional. So I think that's a kind of a good lens for maybe some folks who are further in the journey or just starting, right? And so that's kind of an interesting background for them to hear. So even just taking a step back, what was the impetus for launching your new diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging efforts in 2020? And then also, can you share more about the pledge? I know we've talked about this, but maybe share with the audience what that looks like and why GoPro decided to opt in.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. It's been a really important tool for us this year, over the last year. But first, I'm going to talk about 2020. So we all went through it. And I live in the United States, and here, last summer was probably one of the most challenging, one of the most traumatic summers that I had ever experienced. And, working from home, I was living in Oakland at the time, Oakland, California. And, every day we would go out and we would go to the protests, or we would go out after the protests had been at night. And obviously, like, the pandemic was still, there was so much unknown. So being in crowds was like really stressful. But I know that what I saw sort of happening around the country, that just wasn't something that I could sort of sit with any longer, and separating and compartmentalizing as like I'm an employee over here and I'm a Black woman over here. I've always tried to show up in like an authentic way, but I think that working from home and living at home and just being like sitting with all of that, really inspired me to speak up in some ways. So I would say we've had a diversity and inclusion program since about 2017. But I took a look and wanted to see, get clear about where we were just holding values and where we were actually taking steps and creating action. So some of the first things, that I did after kind of going through this really challenging period while I was still in it, were, start to reach out to leaders, our folks on our leadership council around diversity and inclusion, and say, especially after George Floyd was murdered, where are we? Like, we haven't really said anything internally. We haven't said anything externally. It feels very confusing as an employee right now. And I mean, action sort of happened right away. And one of the things we did was to hold this 3 company-wide listening sessions, actually, to just bring employees together to kind of just experience, like, listen, speak, but also just kind of be with each other at this really tough time. And I think outside of it being really tough in, like, the social justice space, like, people were just very lonely. Like, and so those were really powerful sessions. People spoke up who don't always speak. And I think that was so inspiring and so powerful in so many ways that, it kind of led to some momentum for us to really take a look at, like, what did it mean to hold values, and what did it mean to, like, bring that to life around diversity and inclusion. So that's a really long answer, but and then so the pledge, as an outdoor lifestyle brand, like, most people who are using GoPros are doing it to capture things, are doing it in the outdoors, right? So this pledge, run by In Solidarity, it's called the Outdoor CEO Diversity Pledge. We were looking for an opportunity to make a stronger commitment and to also find a way to hold ourselves more accountable to progress, because it's not enough to just hold the values. It's about, how we're doing it, actually getting to those goals. So the pledge gave us this wonderful tool to the commitment. The ways in which the pledge asks us to commit are increasing representation across our marketing of BIPOC and LGBTQ folks, including on our athlete and ambassador teams, as well as hiring. So more representation in our hiring as well, and training and education. So it became this way for us to sort of, as we were already reorganizing our program, it was something that helped us, like, kind of create some structure, create some structure there. So yeah, it's been pretty inspiring to kind of see what this big change management has looked like throughout the company, and have this pledge and to hold us sort of to a really steady course. So
that's so helpful. I think so many folks that are new to this work, they're often saying, like, this is such a big topic. Where do I even start? And so I think you gave some really tangible ideas, from listening circle to aspects of the pledge that highlight what exact steps to take. Yeah. Anything else you'd add to that in terms of, like, some best next first steps to take?
Yeah, I think as I've done this work over the years, I've seen a number, I've just kind of had the opportunity to be at companies where, or organizations where they were just kind of trying to figure that out. And everything seems huge, right? But how can you get clear about where you're trying to go and know that that's a long-term vision? But then what are those smaller steps that you can start to take around whether it's workplace inclusion or hiring and retention or your education, whatever those things are? What are those like intermittent steps that can begin to tell you like be key indicators that like, okay, we're moving in the right direction? And I think that has to be right sized for your company and for the size of your team. But I also want to talk about like having having an accountability tool like the Outdoor CEO Diversity Pledge. There is one. So for companies that are not outdoor companies, don't consider themselves in the outdoor space, there's a CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, which is a similar pledge that rallies the business community to advance diversity and inclusion within the workplace. So how can you sort of learn from the companies that are already doing this work? Because I say this all the time internally, this is not a GoPro problem we're trying to fix. Like this is something that is happening, across society. We're looking at systems that we are trying to work to correct. And so how do you learn about what other companies are doing or find the framework out there that can really work for you? I think another really important tool is authentic support from leadership and buy-in. And that's make or break. Because if you are, in a grassroots situation where you're putting in a ton of energy and investment, and oftentimes those tend to be communities that have been historically marginalized, people of color, LGBTQ folks, women doing that work, you're putting in all this energy and you're invested, and you're not going to feel the return if you don't have that leadership support. You don't have decision-making power. It's going to feel like you're pushing. It's going to feel like you have to work against something. So knowing that the company isn't just checking a box, and that the support is thorough and engaged and encouraged, like from leadership, I think that's so key. You just really have to get to a place where leadership is naming it. I think one of the pitfalls that I saw often, in my previous work was people wanted to do this work without naming what they were trying to solve. So they felt more comfortable talking about gender diversity, not comfortable talking about race and ethnicity, and being like very wishy-washy around certain topics. And like, you're just not gonna succeed when you can't name what you're trying to create strategies around. So I think that's another thing, getting like exceptionally clear about what you're trying to do.
Such a good point. If you don't have goals, you'll never achieve them. If you're never working towards something, exactly how you can measure success and track it. Exactly. One last question for me, and then I'll kick it over to Carl. So this is, you've gained some great and very tangible ideas from those folks, really wherever they are on the continuum. But when I think about global perspective, any advice that you'd give in terms of how you've included your global employees, how it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging?
Yeah, I do have some to share, and I will admit this is still a place, where, we have challenges and opportunities to do better. We have global staff, but, a lot of our teams sit here in the U.S. I'm based in the U.S. My experience is in the United States and around these issues. So what I really lean into in truly trying to make this work globally, one is we have an employee engagement group that is global. Each regional office has one called the DEIB force, and that existed, before I stepped into this position. And kind of leaning on and working with those groups to understand what this work means to them, because the context is so different in different cultures. We have some concepts that totally translate, and then some that just don't, given the social constructs. And so some of the things that were grassroots that happened and that we can kind of take and learn from in our Paris office, this was, I think, 2 years ago, the force there decided to do a diversity and inclusion day where they they made this amazing. It was actually one of the first things I watched when I joined. It must have been over 2 years ago because I joined 2 years ago. But they made this amazing video where everyone was just kind of sharing about themselves and their background and what inclusion meant to them. And they hosted several conversations, brought in food from each of their different cultures. And it was just like this day for people to come together and just kind of explore, their shared culture as Parisians, but also all the different cultures that made up that group. And then I think our team in Amsterdam was inspired to do something similar, but they took it in a different direction, and they hosted these discussions for the group. So I think in ensuring that there's support when those types of things are bubbling up as ways for international employees to find their connections to this work. Also, a lot with the way that I look at inclusion as each of us owning that space. So how inclusion to me is not separate from me. It's not separate from you. It is how you show up. It's how you create space for people. It's how you are empathetic and have a growth mindset around relationships. That has been really picked up quite well throughout our global population. Like, we've done trainings around inclusion, trainings around interpersonal bias, and that translates. So finding those things that do resonate, I think, is really important. And then, finding who those champions are in other countries as well. And then the last thing I'll say that we found success, like kind of sharing back and forth between the US, Asia, or Europe, is our internal communications and social platforms. So as a company, we use Workplace. So it's like a place that everyone can go share photos, share experiences. For Women's Month, one of the groups, I think it started in Bucharest or Paris, but they decided to do this thing where they were nominating, they would share about an important woman in their life and then nominate several people. And it was like one of the most powerful experiences. I can remember logging on the Workplace several times a week and just crying in the morning, because they were just like such these powerful stories. And you started to see similarities with people who grew up in Vietnam, or like, it was just super inspiring. And so using the platforms that you have internally to kind of stoke that connection between countries when it can be really challenging to get everyone together in like a certain time.
Anastasia, we've heard a lot of like really amazing things that GoPro and yourself have been doing, but I'm sure there's been a lot of challenges that you faced when going through that diversity and inclusion journey. Could you speak on some of those challenges and how you actually address them?
Yeah. So I will start kind of before GoPro, because I think I touched on this a little bit. Like, I just had the opportunity over the past decade to just be coming into companies when they were trying to kind of get this work off the ground. And now that I kind of look back and have more experience, I can see where some of those pitfalls were. I'll say that as a company who potentially is like trying to do this for the first time, a few of the big pitfalls I would call out is like, watch out for tokenization. Whether that's in forming partnerships or how you're representing people. And I'll kind of define that for you. So that's just, using someone for like a singular identity. If you took a picture of me and you're like, that's a Black woman now, and I want to put her on this cover to represent that this organization cares about Black women, but you didn't know me or you didn't ask me, that's very tokenizing. And that you could see this sometimes happening. And unfortunately, like, when people really start to try to do this work, but they don't put policies and procedures in place around hiring and recruitment, you can actually kind of see that starting to happen in that place too. Partnerships, bringing on new partners solely because of what markets or what customers they represent. So look out for ways to find authentic partnerships, authentic relationships that do not boil people down to their identity. I think that's really important. And then I would say the other thing is knowing that everyone is going to make a mistake. I think going into this with a growth mindset. Everyone is going to make a mistake. I say this time and time again in sort of like my bias trainings. We all hold bias. It doesn't make you a bad person. The behavior, that we're trying to change with these trainings, with this knowledge, is that you're able to understand when it's happened, own up to it, apologize, and move forward. And hopefully over time, not have them as strongly, but knowing that you're going to make a mistake and then choose to go forward, even in the face of the fear of making that mistake, is really powerful. That can't keep you from doing the work. So when I was mentioning maybe people not being comfortable talking about race or ethnicity as something they wanted to target, even if the organization is like, 99% white, that is not okay. You can't be afraid to like make a mistake there. You have to take that personal journey and then, begin to take that as an organization. And I think, some of the challenges, I don't think GoPro's immune from any of that. We've had several years to kind of build through this journey, and knowing that I feel like we've kind of moved into a new phase. That's really inspiring. So it doesn't mean that we don't have challenges either, but I think those are some of the sort of initial challenges I would say to watch out for.
And it's really interesting too, because I know in previous organizations, when you talk about tokenization, at certain points or certain events, like you're trying to be the company or the business, is trying to be mindful, but at the same time too, it doesn't make any sense. Like, for example, I think it was a Chinese New Year, and the company I was using had a stock image of Asian, like an Asian father and his son at an event. But the funny thing is, I went to the postal office and the exact same picture was there. And then I went to the grocery store and the exact same picture was on those dividers. So all three pictures were all on all, and it was like, oh my gosh. And it was funny at the point, because like, I know exactly where they got this picture and I know they're trying, but it's all the same, right?
Yeah.
So that was a miscue from, I think, all three, like the post office, the supermarket and the company using the exact same picture. It was a really good picture, don't get me wrong, but it was so good that all three of them used it. And but you touched on bias too, which is interesting, because as our society moves forward and everything's changing so fast, things that were acceptable or like no one said anything about it maybe 5, even 10, maybe 20 years ago, that's suddenly different, and suddenly things are changing. And I think you're right though, like different people grew up in different eras, and I think if you can just apologize for it and just be mindful that this isn't acceptable or something that it is offensive to people or makes them feel marginalized.
Yeah, and I think that journey is exceptionally hard for people. Like, it's a personal, you have to find like cognitive safety within that journey. If someone is calling you out on something, you're probably immediately defensive and you're like, don't even know why, because your brain has put you in that space, right? But I think, the difference between people who are open to that sort of learning and people who are closed to it is, once they can process that emotional reaction, then they can begin to kind of uncover what was actually wrong with that, or how did I potentially misstep? How can I educate myself to learn here? So I think you're sort of spot on, and these things change fast, so it is a constant learning journey. Yeah.
So knowing what you know now, what recommendations or advice would you provide to a company? Like, I know you mentioned before, you go into organizations who are just getting their diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programs off the ground. What kind of advice or recommendations would you have for companies that are just starting?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to a few things that I mentioned in maybe the previous answer as well, a couple previous answers. I think outside of sort of the tokenization piece or the mistakes, ensuring that where you're sitting in the organization, that if you don't have the power to help make this change, that you have the allies within to have you reached out to someone in leadership? Have you been able to go beyond sort of that, unfortunately, that barrier where there might be great ideas, great momentum, but you're just not reaching out to leaders or reaching decision makers? I think that's really, really tough. And I, speak to colleagues in other companies, and and it really, something that I'm just going to say this really bothers me is like, a lot of companies that have ERGs are really depending on ERGs to be like, that's the program. Like, we've gotten these ERGs, these people who are typically of historically marginalized backgrounds are carrying this work for the company. And often, they're not compensated for that time, and are potentially not having a strong influence within the leadership. There's a power dynamic there, right? Like, so I think for companies are starting out, like, I'm not saying ERGs are bad, ERGs are great, but doing them in a way that actually empowers people, that is developmentally for their career, a really positive force. ERGs are a fantastic space of inclusion for people who there might not be that many of us in the workplace, and we just want to not have to code switch, whatever. But a company cannot solely have their entire program in progress based on having strong ERGs that don't really have like that decision-making power. So I think like being aware of those power dynamics as you're starting a program. Yeah. And I think the investment in making sure that it is someone's job. So this is, gets back to the ERG thing or the volunteer thing. Like, it cannot be, 30 people's job to own this program. It should be, having a team that is dedicated, and how do they work with those different communities or different stakeholders to, create change within. So it's kind of all over the place, but I have a lot of thoughts on that one.
Well, no, I did. No, you mentioned a little earlier about you were watching a lot of inspiring stories, and I know GoPro is obviously a brand that is known for inspiring storytelling. So, how can you let me know what are some examples of how to authentically tell stories related to diversity and impact at work?
Yeah, I think we are really lucky to have a product that like the purpose behind the product is to empower people to sort of self-capture what they're most passionate about. So for us, I think the most authentic way to be able to tell those stories or really show other people's stories that they're trusting us with is to go out there and work with our, group of global ambassadors and open it up to other people as well to share their stories with us. Like, we have this wonderful global and diverse community of creators and athletes who share their lives and their stories. And that representation is really important. So that's a place where we obviously, as their advocates and our athletes, we have the control over, like, okay, if we see an opportunity to have more women or more people of color and more LGBTQ folks, how are we meeting that challenge? But then there's like, also the people who those people inspire. So this, social media like engagement, but reaching out to those communities if they see themselves represented. So, how are we doing a good job in representing these communities and inviting them into our fold through storytelling? People connect so deeply with other people's stories. That's just, I think, how we're wired socially as social animals. And then I think the other way that builds on that too is like from a partnership perspective, we have our GoPro for a Cause program, which is our nonprofit partnership program. And through this diversity and inclusion program, we have the opportunity to authentically like invest in these partnerships. And especially sort of in the outdoor community, do our part in sort of breaking those old stereotypes about who's outdoors. And so how are we taking care to represent people authentically, based on who's using our products and who we can be making new connections with to use the products. So
I love that. I love how it all dovetails so closely and cohesively together. And it is intrinsically linked with your product, just all this diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work. And as we kind of wrap up our time together today, we have one final question as we look on the horizon for the future. We've talked a little bit about how diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging is a continuum, right? And I loved how you said you have to start, you have to hit key milestones, but if you fail, that's okay. If you make mistakes, apologize, acknowledge, and move on, right? Like, how do we keep moving this? How do we keep moving it forward collectively? And, even thinking about this, as you think about GoPro, what would you say is the next phase of your journey around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging?
Yeah, I'll kind of take that in two parts. So, one of the ways in which I kind of approach learning or journey or progress on this topic is through a continuum. I think so often these topics can be like presented in a binary, right and wrong, sexist or not sexist, racist or not racist, whatever the thing is. It can just be like you either are or you aren't, and that's it. I think that that's a mistake, because it's a really intense cognitive and personal journey that people have to take to even establish sort of the psychological safety to go there, to begin to take these issues in. And so I really like this awareness funnel that really takes people through from all the way from unawareness to advocating. So in our program's mission is to move as many people along from that side of establishing psychological safety over to the choosing courage over comfort. And that doesn't mean that every single person is going to be advocating on every single issue, but if they're informed and feeling empowered based on, the education and the space we create for them, I think that is what success sort of looks like for us. So just to give like a quick example of what some of these phases might look like. So unawareness might look like, it's 2021. There's a Black vice president, Black woman vice president. Sexism is obviously a thing of the past. And apathy might look like, well, I've learned a little bit about sexism, and now that is like too big of a thing for me to handle. I can't do that on my own. And so someone is consciously deciding to like check out of that process. But when you're establishing curiosity, you're starting to establish that psychological safety that it takes to even say, well, maybe this is an issue and I can start to learn about it. And that's like where we want to get people, right? Like, and once they're moving over from curious and starting to learn about something, how can we make sure that they're informed and have valid, data-driven information to look into? And the last thing I'll say about it is, I think it's important to recognize that people may be on many different parts of this continuum on different issues. So I think it really allows you to approach things with empathy and a growth mindset, and keeping sort of that continuum in mind. So, so that's sort of how I think about this continuum. And in terms of what's next for us, we actually yesterday just released our first diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging report. As part of our commitment to the Outdoor CEO Pledge, we will be reporting annually, and this was our first time doing that. And that was an incredible undertaking across the business, trying to sort of understand what were our key indicators for progress here. And I think looking forward, like this is going to be having the pledge as a tool, having this report as a tool. This is going to be a good way for us to keep ourselves accountable to doing the work. So I would say that's what's next in our journey, is keeping ourselves accountable, understanding when there needs to be shifts because things change, and keep being accountable to if something isn't working. So we're really excited, and thank you.
So if you want to learn other inspiring examples of social impact and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, you got to check out this playlist here, as well as this playlist for other corporate social responsibility tips and strategies. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll catch you in our next episode.